In 2005, a bridge in Alaska that hadn't even been built yet became the most hated piece of infrastructure in America. Not because it collapsed, not because it was crumbling, but because taxpayers were about to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to connect a town of 8,000 people to an island where fewer than 50 people actually lived. The Gravina Island Bridge was supposed to span nearly 2 miles across the Tongass Narrows near Ketchikan, Alaska. For context, that's longer than the Golden Gate Bridge. The price tag started at $398 million. By the time the project was revised and costs were recalculated, estimates pushed past $600 million. $600 million for a bridge that would primarily serve the Ketchikan International Airport, which sits on Gravina Island, along with a handful of homes and not much else. If you've never been to Ketchikan, here's what you need to understand. It's a small city in the Alaska Panhandle, accessible mainly by boat or plane. The city sits on a narrow strip of land between the mountains and the water, hemmed in on every side by terrain that makes expansion almost impossible. The airport is on Gravina Island because there wasn't suitable flat land in Ketchikan itself for a runway. So to get from the airport to town, you take a ferry. The ferry ride is about 7 minutes. It runs regularly. It costs a few bucks. It works. Was it inconvenient? Sure, a little. Was it worth more than $500 million to replace? That became the question that exploded into a national political firestorm. The funding was secured as a federal earmark, which is basically when a member of Congress designates money for a specific project in their district. Earmarks aren't inherently corrupt, but they became the symbol of what critics called pork barrel spending. Projects that benefit a tiny number of people but get funded because a powerful politician wants to bring money home to their state. In this case, Alaska's congressional delegation was extremely powerful. Don Young, who served as Alaska's sole congressman for decades and chaired the House Transportation Committee, was one of the most skilled appropriators in Congress. The state's representatives pushed hard for infrastructure funding, and the Gravina Island Bridge was tucked into the 2005 federal transportation bill, alongside thousands of other earmarks. The money was allocated. The project was moving forward. And then the media caught wind of it. Journalists started doing the math. $600 million divided by 50 residents. That's $12 million per person living on the island. You could have bought each of them a mansion and a private helicopter and still had money left over. The bridge got a nickname, the Bridge to Nowhere. The name stuck because it was viscerally accurate. You'd be building this massive, expensive piece of infrastructure that didn't connect 2 population centers. It didn't relieve traffic congestion. It wasn't replacing a dangerous or failing crossing. It was replacing a functional ferry to serve an airport and a couple dozen people. Critics pointed out that the ferry had been operating safely for decades and could be significantly upgraded, expanded, or even made permanently free for a tiny fraction of what the bridge would cost. Opponents pointed out that for a fraction of the cost, you could upgrade the ferry service, maybe even run it for free in perpetuity. But that wasn't the plan on the table. The plan was the bridge. By 2005, the Bridge to Nowhere had become a talking point in national politics. It was cited in debates about government waste, about how taxpayer money gets spent on projects that don't make economic sense. Presidential candidates mentioned it on the campaign trail. Late-night talk show hosts made jokes about it. Citizens Against Government Waste gave it their infamous Oinker Award. And suddenly a small bridge proposal in a remote corner of Alaska was front-page news across the country. The public backlash was intense. Here was a project that seemed to encapsulate everything frustrating about how government spending works. The money wasn't being allocated based on need or efficiency. It was being allocated because Alaska's delegation had the power to make it happen. And that power was enormous. Alaska received more federal money per capita than almost any other state in the country, year after year. And to be fair to Ketchikan, locals had legitimate arguments. They'd point out that the airport is vital infrastructure for the region. Ketchikan is isolated. The ferry, while functional, could be disrupted by weather or mechanical issues. Southeastern Alaska sees some of the most severe weather conditions in North America, and a bridge would provide reliable year-round access regardless of conditions. The project would create jobs during construction. It would stimulate the local economy. And by Alaska standards, where building anything requires extraordinary logistics and expense, the costs weren't entirely out of line. But none of that changed the optics. To the rest of the country, this looked like Alaska getting a wildly disproportionate amount of federal money for a project that served almost nobody. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Hurricane Katrina had devastated New Orleans just months earlier, and the federal government was under enormous scrutiny for how it spent money and prioritized needs. People were asking hard questions about infrastructure spending, and the bridge to nowhere was a very easy target. The political pressure mounted. By 2007, Alaska's governor at the time made the decision to officially cancel the project. The federal funding had technically been redirected in a way that gave Alaska more discretion over how to use it, and the state decided the bridge wasn't worth the cost and controversy. But here's the thing. The money had already been allocated to Alaska, so while the bridge didn't get built, the state still received hundreds of millions in federal transportation funds. That money went to other projects across the state. The bridge to nowhere died, but Alaska's infrastructure budget didn't take the hit you might expect. Some of the preliminary work had already been done. Roads leading to where the bridge would have connected were built. There's a stretch of highway on Gravina Island that locals sometimes call the road to nowhere because it was constructed in anticipation of the bridge and now just kind of ends at the waterline, going nowhere. A physical reminder, sitting in the Alaska rain, of a political miscalculation that played out on a national stage. The scandal had lasting effects beyond Alaska. The bridge to nowhere became Exhibit A in arguments about earmark reform. Congress eventually implemented a moratorium on earmarks that lasted for years, fundamentally changing how infrastructure projects get funded. The project became shorthand for government waste in a way that few infrastructure proposals ever do, entering the political vocabulary as a phrase that's still used today to describe any spending that seems wildly out of proportion to its purpose. It's worth asking why this particular project became the symbol. America has plenty of questionable infrastructure spending. There are bridges that serve relatively small populations. There are highways built for development that never materialized. In some ways, the bridge to nowhere was an unlucky example that happened to get attention at the right political moment. But it also genuinely was an extreme case. The cost per resident math was staggering. The lack of clear necessity was hard to defend. And the fact that it was an earmark made it a perfect target for critics of that system. Everything about it was designed, almost accidentally, to generate maximum outrage. The people of Ketchikan, for the most part, just wanted better access to their airport. They became the face of a national debate they didn't necessarily ask for. The project's supporters argued it was about long-term thinking, about investing in Alaska's future, about understanding the unique challenges of infrastructure in remote areas where the normal cost-benefit calculations simply don't apply the same way they do in the lower 48. The project's critics argued it was about politicians spending other people's money on projects that don't make sense anywhere outside the specific political calculations of Congress. Both things can be true. What's clear is that the Gravina Island Bridge became more than just a proposed piece of infrastructure. It became a case study in how projects get funded, how political power shapes spending, and how public perception can kill even a fully funded project. It showed that in the right circumstances, with the right combination of timing and optics and political climate, the court of public opinion can override the machinery of Congress. The bridge to nowhere was never built. But its legacy is still visible in how Americans talk about government spending, in the earmark reforms that followed, and in that road on Gravina Island that leads to a beach instead of a bridge. A $600 million idea that became a punchline, a scandal, and a warning about what happens when the math just doesn't add up.